Hello, and welcome to our video lecture on the fighting of World War I. This is another one of those times where I do feel the need to warn you that this is a brief historical overview, not an in-depth coverage of World War I. If this is something you're interested in, then I suggest you do some outside research or come in early to ask me some specific questions. So, Europe at the start of World War I looks like this, with the Central Powers in purple and the Allied powers in green. Take a good look at these borders, though, because that's one thing that will be very different by the end of World War I. You'll see a lot of border and territory changes. When the war begins in August of 1914, the Europeans were actually enthusiastic about fighting each other. Remember, they just went through a time of great prosperity and increased nationalism, where everyone thinks their country is invincible. They also have just conquered a bunch of African and Asian countries, so they have pretty high opinions of themselves. Most Europeans anticipated that the war would be won quickly by their own country. When most soldiers left home, they told their families they'd be back by Christmas, and boy, were they wrong. When the war begins, the biggest threat to Germany is that they may have to fight this war on two fronts. If you look at the map here, you can see that they have to contend with both Russia and France on their borders. So what they don't want was for them to have to split their army in two and have to be fighting on both sides of their borders. So to make sure this doesn't happen, Germany creates what they call the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan basically said that Germany would attack France first and try to take them over really quick, and they would do it all before Russia was ready to go to war. So after they defeated France, they would send troops to Russia and easily conquer the Russians. It's not exactly the best laid plan. So, it seemed at first like the Schlieffen Plan was working. The German army blew through Belgium and made it into France without a problem, but the English arrived to help the French, and combined they were able to keep Germans out of Paris at the Battle of Marne. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Russian troops were able to mobilize much faster than expected, so Germany had to divert their troops away from France and send them to their eastern border. Since the Schlieffen Plan failed, the Central Powers were forced to fight a two-front war. The fighting between Germany and France's borders will be called the Western Front, and the fighting between Germany and Russia will be known as the Eastern Front. By 1915, the war had settled into a stalemate where each side was fortified in their positions within the trenches. One big difference between World War I and previous wars that have been fought is that this war will be fought using trench warfare. Basically, the technology the Europeans had created, like machine guns and grenades, made it a lot easier to kill each other in mass. So to avoid running into a total massacre, the two sides had to protect themselves from oncoming fire. So they dug trenches to protect themselves. The trenches were usually just tall enough that the soldiers were protected from fire. Life in the trenches was miserable. The soldiers had very bad food, and rats were a big problem in the trenches. They stole people's food and ate corpses they found laying in the trenches. It was not uncommon that these rats could grow to the size of a rabbit while living there. Another factor of trench life was trench foot. There was no system in place to drain the water out of the trenches, so when it rained, the water just sat there. The men's feet never would get fully dry, and as a result, trench foot develops. Do you remember that scene in Forrest Gump when Forrest gets to Vietnam and Lieutenant Dan tells him he needs to change his socks twice a day? That's because they didn't want to get a fungus like trench foot growing on their feet. The trenches were overall just a grim place to be. The soldiers in them were basically living in a constant battle zone for weeks to months on end. As you can imagine, many survivors of the trenches have serious health and mental problems when they come home. The term PTSD is first used at this time, but it will be more commonly referred to as shell shock. One of the big changes that sets World War I apart from previous wars is the new weapons that are invented to gain advantages in the war. To give you some context before we get into our list of new weapons, I want you to think about the level of technology the world had just 40 to 50 years before. Think back to the American Civil War. Only 50 years ago, people were still using single-load rifles and cannons to fight each other. Now we have technology like machine guns. Long-range artillery develops that can fire weapons hundreds of yards to even miles away from their targets. The first versions of tanks are invented and used during World War I to try and bridge the trench gap called no man's land. But people will find out they can be stopped by the invention of flamethrowers and grenade launchers. And while they don't make a large appearance in World War I, airplanes and zeppelins are created. They will be much more prominent in the fighting of World War II. You also see a lot of poison gas and chemical warfare start to be developed as well. And finally, the first submarines are invented and used to wage a whole new type of naval warfare. So again, just think about how much technology has changed in the last 50 years of world history. The Industrial Revolution made so many wonderful things, but it also allowed us to create way too efficient ways to kill each other in mass. These new weapons ensured that during World War I, an estimated 8.5 million soldiers died, and another 21 million soldiers were wounded. In many countries, they lost a whole generation of young men, which will cause numerous economic and social repercussions. The fighting on the Western Front will slow into a stalemate where neither side is able to gain an advantage. And even when they did win battles, they really didn't gain enough to make the battle worthwhile. For example, usually in war, when you would win a battle and take over a large area of land, you did so for the strategic location as well as for resources. You gained something by winning that area. But the battles of World War I were not like that. Being stuck in the trenches drug battles out to be weeks, even months long. For example, the Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months, and an estimated 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded. And that's just one battle. Another 1 million soldiers were killed during the 5-month Battle of the Somme. You have these huge amounts of death and loss, but when they gain these territories that they've been fighting for, they've been there so long that there are no resources left to win. Neither side is gaining ground or advantages after these battles. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army is struggling to hold on against German military. At this point in time, Russia still has a monarchy. They have not industrialized at the rate Europe did, and they are actually very behind in the modernization process. It becomes very apparent during World War I. Russia was not able to produce enough weapons or food to supply their soldiers. They tried sending all of their supplies to the soldiers, but then their own civilians started dying of starvation. While the exact number is unknown, historians estimate millions of soldiers and civilians died of hunger and exposure during the war, as there was not enough resources to go around. But instead of quitting or importing more resources from abroad, the Russian government did not want to lose face, so they kept throwing more and more young Russian men into the fighting. By 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. The stalemate on the Eastern and Western fronts turned World War I into a war of attrition, which basically means that each side is just trying to outlast the other. So no longer is it about who has the superior military or fighting skills, but more really about who can outlast the enemy and produce more resources. To do this, nations have to commit to what is called total war to win World War I. Total war is the idea that literally everything your nation does is contributing towards the war effort. Factories that used to make toys or furniture or other non-essential items are now used to make war equipment. Industrial resources are now rationed to prioritize military needs. The governments will start to use conscription to draft civilians into the military. You know a war is getting bad when the government has to force people to go fight in it. You start to see propaganda being used everywhere to keep up civilian support for the war. And you also will start to see the overseas colonies being used to gain resources and additional soldiers during this time. Let's think on that for a moment. Which countries have the most overseas colonies in Africa and Asia during this time? Maybe Britain or France? I wonder if that will have any impact on the outcome of the war. So Germany also has some colonies in Africa they want resources from. But if you remember, they are landlocked in by the Allies. So they need to use their recently created Unterseeboots, yes, that is exactly what they called them, I just spoke German there for you, to get more resources to continue fighting. The British realize this and try to blockade Europe to keep the Germans from being able to trade. Germany responds to this by using unrestricted submarine warfare to attack the British Navy and any merchant ships supplying the Allies. In the map here, they show all of the ships that were sunk by German submarines in about a year's time span. So all of those dots that you see surrounding the UK, those are all shipwrecks because of German submarines. These German U-boat attacks is actually what will bring the United States into World War I. While the US had claimed to remain neutral from the conflict going on in Europe, they had been supplying their allies, the British, throughout the entire war with weapons and food. Several ships will be sunk by the Germans that the US had citizens on. US President Woodrow Wilson will demand that Germany allow freedom of the seas for passenger ships and merchant ships, but Germany will refuse. The American people will be outraged in May of 1915 when a German U-boat sank a British ship called the Lusitania and killed 1,200 people on board, including 128 American passengers. This was a passenger ship, civilians just trying to travel across the Atlantic. But you notice this happens in 1915, but the US doesn't enter the war until 1917. If this doesn't get them into the war, what will? What brings America into the war is the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. Germany knew that eventually their submarine attacks would bring the US into the war. So Germany proposes to Mexico in this telegram that if Mexico makes an attack on the US, when the Central Powers win the war, they will give Mexico the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This, of course, outrages the American people and pushes the United States into the war. I'm not one to believe in many conspiracy theories, but I do find the Zimmermann telegram just a little too convenient. It came at just the time that the Allies needed aid the most, and this telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence officers. And also, Mexico was in no real position to attack the United States. The president of Mexico came out and said that right after the publication of the telegram. Just seems pretty convenient timing to me. That's all I'm saying. So, on April 2nd, 1917, the United States officially declares war on Germany and enters the war in Europe. So think about it this way. By 1917, World War I had been going on for 3 full years now. Nations have committed to total war and have put all of their resources and men into this war. Any shift of power in either side would have been enough to change the entire course of the war. So when America comes in to the fighting, it makes a huge difference because of their numbers and their resources going towards the Allies. This actually works out well because the Russians had the Bolshevik Revolution going on in 1917, and the new communist government that defeated the nobility of Russia will sign a peace treaty and get Russia out of the war. So now Russia is no longer Russia. They're the Soviet Union, and we will talk more about them later during the 1920s and 30s. By 1918, the Central Powers were running out of supplies. They had tried one last attack into France, where they focused all of their power and efforts. The Allies, though, were able to hold off their attack. In October of 1918, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered. And then 1 month later, Germany agreed to a ceasefire, and World War I officially comes to an end. We will talk about the Treaty of Versailles and the repercussions of World War I in our next video. But before we go, let's look at the loss of life World War I left us with. The 3 countries with the most casualties are Germany, Russia, and France. The total number of lives lost are estimated to be close to 10 million people. The Great War left Europe in ruins and set the stage for continued conflict in the 20th century. Thanks for watching, and look out for our next episode on totalitarianism in the times between the war.